When Margaret Thorne stepped onto that aircraft bound for West Africa on the morning of February 14th, 2024, her heart carried something it hadn't held in years. Hope. For 3 months, she had spoken to a man who understood grief the way only the grieved can. A doctor who saved lives in forgotten villages. A widower who quoted scripture and spoke about second chances. His name was Emmanuel Assam, and he promised her that loneliness didn't have to be permanent. But 5 days after her wheels touched African soil, that hope turned to horror. The clinic she believed healed the sick was built on something you wouldn't expect. And the man who spoke of saving lives had actually been ending them, one by one, in ways that still make seasoned investigators turn away. Who was Emmanuel Assam? What was really happening inside that compound, where patients checked in but never checked out? And how did a 65-year-old retired nurse from Portland, Oregon, become the only woman to escape a place where 47 others had vanished? Margaret's story begins not in Africa, but in the quiet suburbs of the Pacific Northwest, where silence had become the loudest sound in her world. By the time Margaret Thorne turned 65, silence had settled into her home like dust on forgotten furniture. Her 2-story house in northeast Portland still smelled faintly of the lavender sachets her late husband Tom used to buy her every anniversary. But Tom had been gone for 3 years now, and the sachets were running out. Margaret had spent 4 decades as a registered nurse at Providence Portland Medical Center. She knew how to read a patient's vitals before the monitors did. She understood pain, not just the clinical kind measured in scales from 1 to 10, but the deeper kind that lives in a person's eyes when they've lost something they can't get back. After Tom's heart attack in January 2021, she became intimately familiar with that second type. Her daughter Jessica lived in Tokyo, working impossible hours at a tech firm. Her son David was stationed in Munich with his German wife and 2 children Margaret had only met twice through video screens. They called on birthdays and holidays. Their voices stretched thin across time zones and obligations. She told them she was fine, because that's what mothers do. But fine is not the same as whole. In the summer of 2023, her doctor found a lump. Stage 1 breast cancer, caught early, treated aggressively. By October, she was declared in remission. The day she got the news, she sat alone in her kitchen and realized she'd survived death, but was still living like she was dying. The quiet had become unbearable. Not the peaceful kind that follows a long day, but the hollow kind that makes you wonder if anyone would notice if you stopped making noise altogether. Her sister Claire lived 2 hours south in Eugene and visited monthly, always with the same worried expression and the same question. "When are you going to start living again, Maggie?" Margaret would smile and change the subject, because the truth felt too heavy to say out loud. She didn't know how to start living when everything she'd built her life around was gone. November arrived cold and gray, the way it always does in the Pacific Northwest. Margaret made her morning tea, fed the neighbor's cat through the fence, and opened her laptop with a resignation that felt both terrifying and necessary. She'd seen the commercials during her afternoon television marathons. Silver singles. Mature dating for mature hearts. The tagline felt like it was speaking directly to her loneliness. She created a profile on November 15th, 2023. The photo she chose was from Jessica's last visit, taken on the porch swing where she and Tom used to sit. She wore a soft blue cardigan and a smile that almost reached her eyes. Her bio was simple, honest, stripped of pretension. Retired nurse, recent widow, still learning to laugh again, looking for kindness and conversation. For days, nothing happened. A few generic messages from men whose profiles felt like they'd been copied and pasted from a manual on how to seem interested. She responded politely, felt nothing, and let the conversations fade. She told Claire maybe this was a mistake. Claire told her patience was part of the process. Then, on the evening of November 18th, 2023, a notification arrived that would change everything. The message came through at 7:43 p.m., just as Margaret was pouring her second cup of chamomile tea and debating whether to finish the mystery novel on her nightstand or surrender to another evening of mindless television. The message was different from the others. It didn't start with a compliment about her smile or a question about her hobbies. It simply said, "A nurse and a doctor. Maybe we were always meant to find each other when the healing needed to go both ways." His name was Emmanuel Assam. His profile said he was 58 years old, a widower, and a humanitarian physician running a medical clinic in rural Ghana. The photos showed a man with kind eyes and graying temples, standing beside cinder-block buildings painted in fading pastels. In one image, he held a small child on his hip while gesturing toward a freshly dug well. In another, he wore scrubs and stood among a group of villagers, his smile wide and unguarded. Margaret stared at the message for a long time before responding. Something about the phrasing felt intentional, careful, like he'd actually read her profile instead of skimming it. She typed and deleted 3 responses before settling on something simple. "That's a beautiful way to look at connection. Tell me about your work." His reply came within minutes, and that set the rhythm for everything that followed. They talked that first night until well past midnight, the conversation flowing with an ease Margaret hadn't felt in years. He told her about losing his wife Grace during childbirth 5 years earlier, how the grief had pushed him to leave his private practice in Accra and move to the rural north where people had nothing but needed everything. He described days that began before sunrise and ended long after dark, stitching wounds by lantern light and delivering babies in homes with dirt floors. She told him about Tom, about the sudden way he'd left her, about the anger she still carried that he didn't get to say goodbye. She told him about the cancer, about sitting in waiting rooms alone, about the fear that had lived in her chest until the day the doctor said remission. Emmanuel didn't offer platitudes or try to fix her pain. He simply said, "You've carried a lot by yourself. You don't have to anymore." Over the following weeks, they fell into a pattern. Good morning messages that arrived with her first cup of coffee, midday check-ins where he'd share a verse from the Psalms or a line from a patient's thank you letter. Evening calls when the clinic was closed and the generator hummed in the background. His voice was deep and measured, with an accent that softened the edges of English into something almost musical. He asked about her children, about her nursing career, about the small joys she'd forgotten she was allowed to have. When she mentioned missing the weight of purpose, he understood without her having to explain. When she admitted she sometimes went whole days without speaking to anyone, he started sending voice notes just so she'd hear another human voice. But there were moments that didn't sit quite right, small things that brushed against her instincts before dissolving into his reassurances. When she suggested a video call, he apologized and explained that the internet in his region was too unstable for anything beyond voice. When she asked why his photos never showed his full surroundings, he laughed and said he wasn't photogenic, that he preferred to let the work speak instead of his face. When he sometimes disappeared for a day or two without explanation, he'd return with elaborate apologies about emergencies at the clinic, about patients who needed him more than his phone did. Jessica called from Tokyo on a Sunday afternoon in early December and noticed something different in her mother's voice. "You sound lighter, Mom. What's going on?" Margaret told her about Emmanuel, about the conversations that made her feel seen again. Jessica's tone shifted immediately. "Mom, have you video called him? Have you verified anything he's told you?" Margaret felt her defenses rise. "He's a busy doctor in a rural area, Jess. Not everyone lives online like your generation." The call ended with tension neither of them knew how to name. Jessica sent articles about romance scams later that evening. Margaret read them, felt the familiar sting of being treated like she couldn't take care of herself, and decided her daughter was being overprotective. In mid-December, Emmanuel's messages grew more personal, more intimate. He spoke about the future in a way that felt both careful and inevitable. "I know this might sound forward, Margaret, but I can't stop imagining what it would be like to have someone to share this work with, someone who understands medicine and compassion the way you do." She read that message 3 times, her heart doing something it hadn't done since Tom was alive. Then, on January 8, 2024, He sent the invitation that would lead her across an ocean and into a nightmare she never saw coming. "Margaret, I've been thinking. What if you came to visit? Not as a tourist, but as a partner. Come see the clinic, meet the people, use your nursing skills for something that matters. Stay as long as you'd like. Let me show you what purpose looks like when it's built from the ground up." She sat with that message for 2 days, reading it over breakfast, during her evening walks, late at night when sleep wouldn't come. Claire visited that weekend and found her sister staring at a world map spread across the kitchen table. "Maggie, what are you thinking?" Claire asked, though her tone said she already knew. Margaret looked up, and for the first time in 3 years, her eyes held something other than grief. "I'm thinking I survived cancer for a reason. I'm thinking maybe that reason isn't to sit in this house waiting to die." On January 12, 2024, Margaret Thorne purchased a round-trip ticket to Accra, Ghana, departing February 14th, Valentine's Day. She told herself it was symbolic, a new beginning, a second chance at feeling alive. What she didn't know was that Emmanuel Assam wasn't the man in those photos, and the clinic wasn't saving lives, it was ending them in ways that would make even hardened investigators struggle to sleep. If you're still with us, stay close, because Margaret's journey is just beginning, and the truth waiting for her in that remote village is darker than anything her nursing career ever prepared her for. February 14th, 2024. Valentine's Day. The alarm went off at 4:30 a.m., but Margaret had already been awake for an hour, staring at her packed suitcase by the bedroom door. Inside, folded between her clothes, was the framed photo of Tom she'd kept on her nightstand for 3 years. She kissed it once before tucking it into the side pocket, whispering something only she and his memory would ever know. By 6:15 a.m., she was pulling into the departures lane at Portland International Airport. The sky was still dark, the terminal lights reflecting off rain-slicked pavement. She checked in alone, moved through security alone, and sat at gate C7 drinking coffee that had gone cold while she watched families embrace and businessmen scroll through phones with dead eyes. At 7:02 a.m., Jessica's face appeared on her phone screen, calling from Tokyo where it was already tomorrow. "Mom, please, one more time, just tell me you've shared your location." Margaret sighed, patient but firm. "It's shared with you and David. I have the address. I have his phone number. I'm a grown woman, not a child." Jessica's expression tightened. "That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying be careful. People aren't always who they claim to be online." Margaret felt the familiar rise of defensiveness. "Emmanuel is a doctor helping people who have nothing. I'm going to see his work, maybe offer my skills, that's all." The call ended with, "I love you," exchanged like a treaty neither side fully believed in. The flight to Amsterdam took 9 hours. Margaret sat in 23F, a window seat she'd requested specifically so she could watch the world fall away beneath her. Somewhere over the Atlantic, she opened the journal Jessica had given her last Christmas, still mostly blank except for a few half-finished thoughts from the early days of her diagnosis. She clicked her pen and wrote in careful script, "Maybe this time, life gives instead of takes." The layover in Amsterdam was 4 hours of fluorescent lighting and overpriced sandwiches. The second flight, Amsterdam to Accra, stretched another 6 hours. Margaret barely slept. She watched the route map on the seatback screen, the little plane icon inching across the Sahara, and wondered what version of herself would step off on the other side. The wheels touched down at Kotoka International Airport at 3:47 p.m. local time, February 15th. The cabin filled with the sounds of passengers gathering bags and switching on phones. Margaret's screen lit up with a text from Emmanuel. "Welcome to Ghana, my dear. Driver waiting for you outside arrivals. His name is Kofi. I'm so sorry I can't be there myself. Emergency at the clinic. I'll see you tonight." She read it twice, disappointment settling in her chest. She had imagined this moment differently. His smile waiting at the gate. Flowers maybe, the kind of reunion that made all the distance worth it. Instead, there was Kofi, a thin young man in a faded polo shirt, holding a handwritten sign with her name misspelled, Margaret Thornton. He took her suitcase without much ceremony and led her to a dust-covered sedan parked in a no-waiting zone. Dr. Assam says, "Sorry, very busy today. I take you to him." Margaret climbed into the back seat, the vinyl cracking under her weight, and tried to push down the unease crawling up her spine. The drive out of Accra was chaos. Motorcycles weaving between cars, street vendors pressing goods against windows at every red light, the smell of exhaust and grilling meat thick in the humid air. But after an hour, the city thinned. Paved roads became red dirt, shacks became buildings, the horizon stretched wide and empty under a sky so blue it hurt to look at directly. Kofi didn't speak much. When Margaret asked how long he'd worked for Emmanuel, he said, "Not long." When she asked about the clinic, he shrugged, "I just drive." Her phone signal dropped somewhere past the second hour. She checked twice, 3 times, then forced herself to put it away. This was an adventure. Adventure meant uncomfortable. It didn't mean dangerous. By the time they reached Nkrankrama, the sun was low and orange, casting long shadows across the village. Children played in the dirt. Women carried water jugs on their heads. Goats wandered freely, bells clanking from their necks. Kofi turned down a narrow path and stopped in front of a compound surrounded by chain-link fencing topped with barbed wire. Margaret stared at the wire, at the 2 men standing near the gate with something that looked too much like rifles. Kofi noticed her looking. "Security," he said simply. "Thieves come at night. This area is not always safe." She wanted to ask why a medical clinic needed armed guards, but Kofi was already pulling her suitcase from the trunk. The compound was modest. A main house with peeling yellow paint, 2 smaller outbuildings, one with a red cross barely visible on the door, a generator humming somewhere out of sight. The air smelled like dust and something chemical she couldn't name. Bleach, maybe, or disinfectant. Margaret's nursing instincts kicked in immediately, cataloging details the way she used to on hospital rounds. The clinic building had bars on the windows. The door was padlocked from the outside, and through a gap in the curtains of the main house, she saw someone move quickly past, then disappear. Then he appeared. Emmanuel stepped out onto the porch, wiping his hands on a towel, still wearing scrubs that looked too clean for a man who just finished an emergency. His smile was wide, warm, exactly like his photos. "Margaret, you're here. Finally." He came down the steps and embraced her, and for a moment the unease softened. His voice was the same. His presence felt real. This was the man she'd been talking to for months. "Welcome to my world," he said, pulling back to look at her. "I know it's not much, but it's home." She smiled, trying to match his energy. "It's more than I expected." He gestured toward the main house. "Come, you must be exhausted. Let's get you settled, and I'll show you everything tomorrow in the daylight." As she followed him inside, she glanced back at the clinic building. One of the guards was watching her. Not threatening, just watching. And through the barred window, she thought she saw a face pressed against the glass, pale and still. But when she blinked, it was gone. The inside of the main house was sparse. A couch covered in a faded floral sheet, a wooden table with mismatched chairs, a single bulb hanging from the ceiling, casting everything in harsh yellow light. Emmanuel set her suitcase down near a doorway that led to a small bedroom. Margaret looked around, her nurse's eye catching details that didn't fit. The windows had heavy curtains drawn tight. There was a lock on the outside of the bedroom door, and on the kitchen counter she saw 2 glasses, one still wet, as if someone had just washed it in a hurry. Emmanuel noticed her noticing. "I wasn't expecting you until later," he said quickly. "I haven't had time to tidy properly. Please, sit. Let me get you something to drink. You must be dehydrated after all that travel." She sat on the couch, exhaustion finally catching up to her. He returned with a glass of orange juice, ice cubes clinking against the sides. "Freshly squeezed this morning," he said. "The children from the village brought the oranges. They're very sweet." Margaret took a sip. It was sweet. Almost too sweet. She set it down on the table and looked at him directly. "Emmanuel, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Anything." "Why all the security? The guards, the barbed wire? It feels like more than just theft prevention." His expression flickered, just for a second. Something moved behind his eyes before the warmth returned. "This region has problems. Bandits. People who would steal medical supplies and sell them. I work too hard to let everything be taken. I'm protecting what we've built here." She wanted to believe him. She wanted the explanation to smooth over the instinct screaming quietly in the back of her mind. That night, she lay in the small bedroom, the unfamiliar sounds of rural Ghana pressing against the walls. Insects, distant voices, the generator's rhythmic hum. And something else, something that sounded like crying, muffled and far away, coming from the direction of the clinic building. She got up, moved to the window, pulled the curtain back just an inch. The compound was dark except for a single light near the clinic door. One of the guards stood smoking a cigarette, his rifle slung over his shoulder. And then she saw Emmanuel crossing the yard with a flashlight, heading toward the locked building. He glanced back at the main house once before disappearing inside. Margaret let the curtain fall and stood in the darkness, her heart beating faster than it should. She told herself it was jet lag, culture shock, the strangeness of being somewhere so far from everything familiar. But deep down, in the place where her nursing instincts lived, she knew something here was very, very wrong. That first night, Margaret couldn't sleep. The heat was suffocating, but that wasn't what kept her awake. Around midnight, the generator died. In the silence that followed, she heard it. Muffled crying from the direction of the clinic building. Then voices, low and urgent, speaking in a language she didn't recognize. The sound rose and stopped abruptly, like someone had been silenced. She moved to the window. One of the guards stood rigid outside the clinic door, not relaxed, but alert, watching. Then Emmanuel appeared, crossing the yard with a flashlight, entering the locked building. He glanced back toward the house once before disappearing inside. A soft knock made her jump. "Margaret, everything okay? You seem nervous." Emmanuel stood in her doorway, still in scrubs, concern on his face. She forced a smile. "Just jet lag, hard to adjust." He studied her face a moment too long. "Tomorrow, I'll show you everything. It'll make more sense in daylight." After he left, she noticed something. The bedroom door had no lock on the inside, only on the outside. She whispered to herself what she'd been trying to ignore since arrival. "I told myself it was jet lag, culture shock, but my nursing instincts were screaming." Morning came. Emmanuel announced he had village rounds and would return in an hour. The moment his car disappeared down the road, Margaret made a decision. She needed to see inside that clinic, because whatever was happening behind those barred windows wasn't just medicine. And the truth waiting there would shatter everything she thought she knew about the man she'd flown across the world to meet. February 16th, morning. The compound was quiet, except for chickens scratching in the dirt and the distant hum of village life beyond the fence. Margaret moved carefully across the yard, her sandals crunching on gravel, eyes fixed on the locked building Emmanuel called his storage facility. The main door was padlocked, but as she circled the structure, she noticed a window on the far side, partially hidden by overgrown bushes. The louvers were old, rusted, and one section sat crooked, creating a gap just wide enough to see through. She crouched down, her knees protesting, and peered inside. The room was dim, but enough morning light filtered through to reveal what shouldn't be there. The walls were covered with newspaper clippings, most in French, not English. She could make out headlines: Liberian war crimes, UN tribunal, wanted. Photos were tacked beside them. Emmanuel's face, but young and hard. He wore military fatigues, an assault rifle slung across his chest. Beneath one photo, a caption, Commander Zola. Beneath another, General Queso. Her breath caught. This wasn't a doctor. This was someone else entirely. She pressed closer to the window, her heart hammering. Against the back wall stood a metal rack holding not medical supplies, but weapons. Machetes, ammunition boxes. A map of West Africa was spread across a table. Village names marked in red ink. Some were circled, others were crossed out with violent slashes. Margaret's mind raced, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. War criminal, militia commander. The man who'd quoted scripture and spoken about healing was someone who'd destroyed, not saved. She pulled back from the window, her hands shaking, and that's when she heard the footsteps behind her. Emmanuel. She turned slowly. He stood 10 feet away, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. The warmth was gone. What replaced it was something cold and watchful. You weren't supposed to see that. His voice was calm, too calm. Margaret straightened, drawing on every ounce of composure her nursing career had taught her. She de-escalated violent patients, talked down addicts in withdrawal, faced grieving families who wanted someone to blame. She knew how to keep her voice steady, even when fear screamed inside her. Emmanuel, she said quietly. That's not your real name, is it? Silence stretched between them. A goat bleated somewhere in the distance. Then he exhaled slowly, something like resignation crossing his face. No, it's not. He gestured toward the main house. We should talk inside. She didn't move. Here is fine. He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. Fair enough. My name is Josiah Mensah. I was a commander during the Liberian Civil War. I did things, Margaret. Terrible things. Villages burned, people killed. I can't undo any of it. When the war ended, I had 2 choices. Face a tribunal and spend my life in prison, or disappear. So, you became Emmanuel, a psalm, a doctor. Yes. He ran a hand over his face. I came here 15 years ago with money I'd taken during the war. I built this clinic. I learned medicine from the internet, from books, from trial and error. I've delivered babies, treated malaria, set broken bones. I've tried to give back what I took. Margaret's voice hardened. You think saving a few lives erases what you did? No. His eyes met hers. Nothing erases it. But doing nothing would have been worse. I couldn't bring back the dead, but I could stop more from dying. That had to count for something. She studied his face, searching for deception, for manipulation. What she found instead was something she hadn't expected. Genuine remorse. The kind that lives in a person's bones, that never fully lets go. Her nursing instincts, the same ones that had screamed warnings the night before, now registered something more complicated. This man had done monstrous things, but the man standing before her was carrying the weight of those things like chains he couldn't remove. Why tell me this now? Why not just let me leave? Because you saw. And because I'm tired of lying to the one person who seemed to see past everything else. He stepped closer. Not threatening, just weary. I know you'll probably turn me in. Maybe that's what I deserve. But I wanted you to know the clinic is real. The work is real. Whatever happens to me, I hope someone continues it. Margaret's mind spun. She thought of the children she'd seen in his photos, the wells he'd built, the gratitude in villagers' faces. She thought of the man who'd killed innocents decades ago and the man who'd spent years trying to atone. I need time, she finally said. Time to think. I won't turn you in today, but I need to see your work. Prove to me this clinic actually helps people. Relief flickered across his face. Thank you. I'll show you everything. Starting tomorrow, You can work alongside me. See exactly what we do here." She nodded, still uncertain, still afraid, but curious enough to stay one more day. What Margaret didn't know was that the truth went far deeper than war crimes and stolen identities, and the real horror of what happened in that clinic was something even her worst fears hadn't begun to imagine. February 16th through 18th. Margaret stayed. She watched. And what she saw didn't add up. Josiah invited her to observe his work, to see the healing he claimed defined his redemption. On the first morning, 3 patients arrived. A young woman with a persistent cough, an older man complaining of stomach pain, a teenage boy with a wound on his leg. Josiah examined them with surprising competence, his bedside manner gentle, his diagnoses seemingly sound. But by evening, all 3 were gone. Not discharged, gone. When Margaret asked where they went, Josiah said they'd been referred to a larger hospital in the next region. The answer came too quickly, too rehearsed. The second day she noticed the medical supplies. Inventory didn't match usage. There were boxes of sedatives far more than a rural clinic would need, surgical equipment that seemed too advanced for the basic care he claimed to provide. And the quantities were off. She'd managed hospital supply rooms for years. She knew when numbers didn't tell the truth. The villagers who came to the compound didn't look grateful. They looked afraid. Their eyes darted to the guards. They spoke in whispers. When Margaret tried to ask a woman in broken English how long she'd been receiving treatment, the woman shook her head and hurried away. The guards watched Margaret constantly. Not with hostility, but with the attention of men making sure she stayed where she was supposed to. And at night, the screams came again. Distant, muffled, cut short. When she mentioned them to Josiah at breakfast, he waved it off. Wild animals. Hyenas sometimes come close to the fence. They make sounds that seem human. But Margaret had heard human pain. She knew the difference. On the morning of February 18th, Josiah left for the village, claiming he needed to check on a family whose child had been sick. He'd be gone for hours. Margaret waited until his car disappeared, then moved with purpose. She'd seen him use a laptop in the main house, always closing it quickly when she entered the room. Now she opened it. No password. The screen lit up, and she navigated to a folder labeled Patient Records. Her hands trembled as she clicked it open. The files appeared on screen. Not patient charts. Transaction logs. Subject F12, age 34. Admitted February 3rd with respiratory infection. Liver extraction successful. Viability confirmed. Buyer, Okra. Payment received, 47,000 euros. Margaret's stomach dropped. She scrolled down. Subject M08, age 41. Admitted January 28th with abdominal pain. Bilateral kidney harvest. Cardiac complications during procedure. Subject expired. Disposal, Zone 4. Her vision blurred. She kept reading, unable to stop. Subject F19, age 22. Admitted February 10th with malaria symptoms. Cornea removal successful. Heart stopped post-extraction. Burial site, behind compound. Coordinates logged. 47 entries. 47 people. Dates going back 8 years. This wasn't a clinic. It was a harvesting operation. Margaret pushed back from the desk, her breath coming in short gasps. The patients who arrived sick weren't being treated. They were being sedated, assessed for organ viability, and butchered. The surgeries happened at night. The screams she'd heard weren't animals. They were people waking up mid-extraction or dying on a table in that locked building. Josiah Mensah hadn't changed. He'd evolved. He'd gone from killing with guns to killing with scalpels, and he'd made it profitable. She thought of the war criminal confession, the remorse in his eyes, the story of redemption he'd sold her so convincingly. It was all a lie. Or worse, it was a partial truth designed to distract from something far more monstrous. Her mind raced. She had to leave. Now. But the compound was guarded. Her phone had no signal. The nearest village was kilometers away, through unfamiliar terrain. Then she heard the car engine. He was back early. Margaret closed the laptop, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped it. She moved to the window and saw Josiah stepping out of the sedan, speaking to one of the guards. He glanced toward the house, and even from a distance, she could see his expression shift. He knew. Somehow he knew. She had seconds to decide. Pretend she saw nothing and wait for a chance to escape? Or confront him and risk never leaving at all? But before she could move, Josiah entered the house, his footprints slow and deliberate. When he appeared in the doorway, his face was calm, but his eyes were different. The warmth, the remorse, everything that had seemed human before was gone. "You found them, didn't you? The files." He didn't sound angry. He sounded resigned. Margaret's voice barely worked. "What have you done?" "What I've always done," he said quietly. "Survive. The war taught me that people are resources. Organs are worth more than lives, Margaret. Especially here, where lives are cheap and demand is endless." She backed toward the door. "You're killing them! Innocent people!" He stepped closer. They were going to die anyway. Malaria, infections, poverty. I just made their deaths useful. My buyers save lives with those organs. Children in Europe. Wealthy men in Dubai. People who matter. People who can pay, you mean? Yes. He didn't flinch. And the money funds this place. The wells, the school I built 2 villages over. You think charity pays for that? This does. Margaret's face turned to white. But why target Margaret? At 65, her organs held no value on the black market. The truth was far more calculated. Josiah had been using dating apps for years, targeting women with specific profiles. Widows, isolated, medical backgrounds preferred. Margaret was the 6th woman he'd lured to Ghana. 4 before her never left the compound alive. One had escaped and disappeared before authorities could verify her story. Margaret was number 5 who'd actually arrived. He didn't want her organs. He wanted her expertise. A registered nurse with 4 decades of experience could assist with extractions, manage post-operative complications, help him scale the operation. Her skills were worth more than her body parts. And if she refused to help, the mass grave behind the compound had room for one more. Margaret understood this now. She also understood that running was her only chance at survival. February 19th, 11:30 p.m. Margaret sat across from Josiah at the wooden table, the single bulb above them casting harsh shadows on their faces. He'd laid out his proposition with the cold logic of a businessman. "Help me, Margaret. You assist with procedures, manage recovery, keep patients stable. In return, you're protected, compensated, and you get to keep doing what you do best, saving lives." His eyes narrowed. "Or I contact your children and tell them you knew everything, that you stayed willingly, that you're complicit. Who do you think they'll believe?" Margaret let the silence hang. Then she dropped her shoulders, her voice breaking in just the right way. "I've lost everything anyway. My husband, my health, my purpose. Cancer taught me life is meaningless. Maybe you're right. Maybe this is what I'm meant to do now. But I need one night to pray about it, to make peace with this decision." Josiah studied her face. She didn't look away. Finally, he nodded. "One night. We start tomorrow." She returned to her room and waited. An hour passed. 2. She heard Josiah's footsteps move to his own quarters, heard his door close. The compound settled into its nighttime rhythm. guards changing shifts, the generator humming outside. At 1:47 a.m., Margaret moved. She'd palmed a vial of sedatives from the medical supply room earlier that day, tucked it into her waistband. Now she crushed 2 tablets into a cup of water she'd saved from dinner. She stepped outside, approached the nearest guard with a shaking voice. "Please, I can't sleep. The heat. Do you have any water?" He looked annoyed, but accepted the cup she offered. "Just a sip. You can have the rest." He drank. Within 8 minutes, his eyes grew heavy. 12 minutes, he slumped against the fence. Margaret ran to the generator, her nursing training allowing her to identify the fuel line quickly. She disconnected it. The machine sputtered and died. Darkness swallowed the compound. Shouting erupted. Flashlights clicked on. She heard Josiah's voice barking orders in the local dialect. She didn't wait. She grabbed the unconscious guard's phone from his pocket and ran toward the back fence, away from the commotion. The forest beyond was dense, thorned bushes tearing at her skin as she pushed through. Behind her, beams of light swept the compound. Dogs barked. She kept moving, the phone clutched in her hand, praying it would hold a signal when she got far enough away. 20 minutes of stumbling through darkness brought her to a small clearing. In the distance, she saw a structure, a church, its white walls reflecting moonlight. She ran toward it, her lungs burning, and collapsed against the wooden door. Inside, she found a corner behind the altar and finally looked at the phone. 1 bar of signal. Trembling, she opened the photos she'd taken of Josiah's laptop screen before he'd returned. Evidence. Proof. She sent them to Jessica with a single message. "Call police. Ghana. Send help. Location shared." Then she curled into herself and waited for either rescue or capture, whichever came first. February 20th, 6:18 a.m., Tokyo time. Jessica Thorne woke to the buzz of her phone. What she saw made her heart stop. Photos of medical records, listing harvested organs, payment amounts, disposal notes, and her mother's message. She didn't hesitate. Within minutes, she was on the phone with the U.S. Embassy in Accra. Within an hour, the case reached Detective Kwame Adjei of Ghana's Criminal Investigations Department. Adjei had spent 15 years tracking human traffickers and organ smuggling rings. When he saw Margaret's location ping and the evidence photos, he mobilized immediately. This wasn't a rescue. This was a raid. By 10:30 a.m. local time, a joint task force of CID officers and Interpol agents descended on Nkronkrom village. They found Margaret first, dehydrated and terrified but alive, still hiding in the church. A local pastor had brought her water at dawn, but had been too frightened to ask questions. The raid on Josiah's compound came 30 minutes later. Officers breached the gates with a battering ram. Inside the locked clinic building, they found 3 victims, 2 women and 1 man, all sedated, all showing fresh surgical incisions. 1 woman had been opened and closed within the last 12 hours. She would survive, barely. Behind the compound, cadaver dogs led investigators to a disturbed section of earth. They began digging. By sunset, they'd uncovered 17 bodies. Forensic teams would eventually confirm 47 victims total, some buried, some disposed of in ways the report would not make public. Josiah Mensah fled the moment the lights went out. He made it 12 kilometers toward the Togo border before a roadblock stopped him. In his vehicle, officers found 240,000 euros in cash, 3 passports under different names, and a ledger documenting every transaction going back 8 years. When they pulled him from the car, he didn't resist. He simply looked at the officers and said, "I was trying to leave anyway. This was always going to end." March through June 2024. Accra High Court. The trial of Josiah Mensah became international news. Prosecutors presented evidence that painted a portrait of systematic murder disguised as medicine. 47 confirmed victims, organ buyers traced to 8 countries, an estimated $3.2 million in profit over 8 years. The dating app scheme that targeted 6 foreign women, 4 of whom were confirmed dead, 1 still missing. Margaret took the stand on April 22nd. She wore the same blue cardigan she'd packed for her journey, now wrinkled and faded. Her voice was steady, but her hands shook. He didn't just prey on loneliness. He weaponized compassion. I'm a nurse. I spent my life believing people could be redeemed, that everyone deserved a second chance. He used that belief to almost make me complicit in murder. And if I'd been weaker or more desperate, I might have said yes just to feel needed again. The courtroom was silent. Josiah's defense argued diminished capacity, trauma from his years as a child soldier forced into militia service. But the prosecution countered with the ledger, the calculated nature of his crimes, the profit motive that drove every decision. On June 14, 2024, the jury returned. Guilty on all counts. 47 counts of murder, human trafficking, organ smuggling, conspiracy. The judge delivered the sentence without hesitation. Death by hanging. Josiah showed no reaction. He simply nodded, as if he'd been expecting it all along. On December 18, 2024, 9 months after Margaret escaped his compound, Josiah Mensah was executed at Anselm Medium Security Prison. His last words, recorded by a prison chaplain, were read out loud to the press. Dr. Assam was the man I wanted to be. Josiah Mensah is the monster I've always been. I tried to become someone else, but you can't bury what you are. It follows you, and eventually, it wins. February 2025. 1 year later. Margaret Thorne stands at a podium in a Portland senior center, facing an audience of 63 people, most of them over 50, many of them widowed or divorced. Her voice is stronger now, steadier than it was in that Ghanaian courtroom. I thought loneliness was the worst thing that could happen after my husband died. I was wrong. Loneliness made me vulnerable, and vulnerability without wisdom is a predator's paradise. I flew across the world chasing connection and nearly lost my life because I ignored what my instincts were screaming. She's founded Silver Shield, a nonprofit dedicated to educating older adults about online romance scams. She travels to community centers, churches, and retirement homes, sharing her story not as a victim, but as a survivor with a warning. Margaret still lives in the same house in Northeast Portland. But the porch light that used to stay on all night, the one she kept lit out of hope that someone might come home, is now turned off at a reasonable hour. She doesn't need it anymore. She's no longer waiting for someone to save her from loneliness. She saved herself. Margaret Thorne flew across the world believing in second chances. She met a man who'd been given 47 second chances and used every single one to kill. The village of Necrankrum still stands, but the compound is empty now, abandoned and overtaken by weeds. The clinic building where Josiah Mensah performed his extractions has been demolished. In its place, a memorial stone lists the names of the 47 known victims. The town knew him as a healer. The world now knows him as what he truly was. A war criminal who traded bullets for scalpels and never stopped killing. Margaret's story is not unique. Every year, thousands of people, many of them elderly, fall victim to romance scams. Most lose money. Some lose dignity. Margaret nearly lost her life. The warning signs were there. Refusal to video call. Photos that were always distant or cropped. A man who isolated her from family and created urgency around meeting in person. Stories that sounded too good, too perfectly tailored to what she needed to hear. She ignored them because loneliness is a powerful drug, and desperation makes even the smartest people abandon their instincts. If someone you love is planning to meet an online connection for the first time, especially overseas, share this story. Ask questions, verify identities, demand video calls. Trust but verify. And if the person resists transparency, that resistance is the answer. Real love doesn't ask you to travel alone to a foreign country to meet a stranger. Real love doesn't punish you for asking questions, and real love never, ever requires you to ignore the voice inside that says something is wrong. Margaret Thorne learned that lesson in the hardest way possible, but she lived to tell it. 47 others didn't. Remember, awareness saves lives. Stay safe out there.